PP relates to the Policy and Procurement Division. IG is Inspector General, and FIN is the Financial Division. Under the Chief of the SANDF, we had the three arms of the service: the Intelligence Division, Joint Operations, and the Joint Support Division.
Now let's go to the side of the slide that has the DEFSEC. You said the division reflected as PP was the procurement division. Is that correct?
Negative, Chair. PP relates to the policy and I must have misspoken. Policy and Plans Division, and the second oval there is the Acquisition and Procurement Division.
Now, what does the Policy and Planning Division do?
The Policy and Plans Division is responsible for the high-level plans and the policies of the Department of Defense. And it would typically, in earlier testimony, I indicated that one of the policies that was promulgated was in a wrong format. That is a division that would have promulgated the correct format according to which we had to format the acquisition policy. And then, of course, they would also confirm the policies in the long run.
Does that division deal only with policies relating to procurement and acquisitions, or just policies within the SANDF in general?
They deal with policy in the Department of Defense, specifically the SANDF.
The policies relating to acquisition and procurement would be just one of the policies dealt with by that division. Is that correct?
That is correct, Chair.
Now, what is the role played by the division of the Inspector General?
The role of the Inspector General's division is to serve as an internal audit organization within the Department of Defense.
Would that typically also deal with issues of compliance with policies and procedures that have been promulgated in the department?
Chair, that is correct. And as such, the SDPPs were subjected to a number of inspections by the Inspector General staff.
And you said the last column there relates to the finance section of that division. What does that division, what role is played by that division within that department?
Chair, within the department, the finance division deals with the allocation of finances internally in the department and the control of expenditure. So it's budget and expenditure control.
Now, still on that side, immediately below that section that deals with the central staff, are various arms of service of the SANDF. Is that correct?
May I request the question to be stated again, please?
Immediately below that, the division of in the DEFSEC department, you've referred to the various divisions. Immediately below there are Army Acquisition. What are these? Are these directorates or divisions of the various arms of service?
Okay, Chair. Under the Departmental Acquisition and Procurement Division, there are 6 directorates that deals with acquisition and acquisition-related matters. The first one is a Directorate Army Acquisition that deals with Army acquisition projects. Then we have the Directorate Air Force Acquisition, which deals with Air Force acquisition matters. Directorate Naval Acquisition similarly deals with naval acquisition matters. Then we have the DTD, is the Directorate Technology Development. They are not per se part of acquisition as we know it purely, but they deal with technology establishment and the acquisition of technology. And then we have the Directorate Weapon Systems, which deals with the common weapon systems in acquisition. And then we have a Directorate Procurement. Now, when I initially made the distinction between acquisition and procurement, that directorate would have dealt with the procurement side of the division.
And immediately below the various acquisition directorates, there are project teams. Could you just explain what these are?
For each project that is established to satisfy a requirement, a project team is established, and a project officer is appointed, and there's an Arms Corps program manager appointed to that team, and then within that team there are a number of other specialist appointments, and that team then works towards achieving the objectives of a specific project. And they generally, through the project officer and the Arms Corps program manager, answers for the performance and the activities of their projects to those directorates. So the Air Force projects would answer to the Directorate Air Force Acquisition, and the Navy projects would typically answer to the Director Naval Acquisition.
And you say the funding of the acquisitions by the various directorates is through the Stokvel account that you have alluded to earlier in your testimony.
That's the way it was at the time. Correct, sir.
And just for purposes of completeness, there is contracting, and immediately below there is Arms Corps. Could you just briefly mention what the relationship is?
Well, Chair, as I've indicated before, Arms Corps is our acquisition agency, and they clearly participate and have an input into our process, or into the process. And if I can relate it to the R1 and the R2 that is indicated there, Arms Corps would normally be the R2 in these acquisition projects, where they are the contracting authority, where the R1 is the DOD responsible authority. So when one looks at the paperwork of particularly the financial reports, the Arms Corps program manager would fall in the R1 category, or R2 category, and the project officer would generally fall in the R1 category.
Could we then deal with the side of the slide that has the Chief of the South African National Defence Force? We see immediately below the Chief there are various positions. Could you just explain what those are?
Okay. Chair, below the Chief of the SANDF, we have the Arms of the Service, AOS, and that breaks up into the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and the medical services, or the medical health services. There is also an intelligence division indicated there as INT, and the Joint Operations Division, which is indicated there as JOPS. The Joint Operations Division is the division that actually deploys the forces, whereas the Arms of the Service prepares the forces. And the Acquisition and Procurement Division on the left-hand side of the diagram acquires the equipment for the forces. And Joint Support, that is indicated as JSUP there is responsible for the general support activities within the SANDF. And that consists of subsections for logistics, personnel, police, and command management information systems, which is indicated there by CMI. Regrettably, I am unable to see what is written in the red block. Just to shed light on that, Chair, that is relates, it's TRG, and it's for training.
Now, at the bottom there's the staff. Could you say what that is?
That is a staff function that resides under the Chief of the SANDF, and it contains in the middle the Chaplain General, so the chaplain services, the service corps, the part-time component, CC is for corporate, the corporate communication services, and I'm not sure, I can't offhand remember what the AG stands for.
Could we, I would imagine that the chair is now clarified with the various aspects of that slide. Now, having dealt with that slide, Captain, we can now proceed to deal with the next slide, which is slide 25.
Okay, Chair, just as an indication of how the system functioned prior to the new dispensation, in the arms embargo, Arms Corps and the SANDF to a large extent worked very much in silos with a clear divide line between them. If we now look at the next slide, which is the post-civil control period, which means post-defense review after the Secretariat of Defense has been created, we will see a much more integrated approach where you had the cabinet at the top, a Council of Defense, obviously had an input to cabinet, and then you can see the two legs, the DOD and Arms Corps on the sides. They fed into a set of fora, which I will elaborate on extensively later on. It's called the AACB, the AASB, and the AAC. It's the AACB is the Armaments Acquisition Control Board, which is chaired by the Chief of Acquisition at that time, nowadays by the Chief of the Defense Material Division. The Armaments Acquisition Steering Board at a higher level, which is chaired by the Secretary for Defense, and the Armaments Acquisition Council, which is chaired by the Minister of Defense. And we will note the arrows leading from the sides, from the DOD and Arms Corps, pointing towards these fora, which gives an indication that the DOD and Arms Corps has seats on those fora. Clearly, the integrated project teams which we've created post this time is staffed by the DOD and by components of the Arms Corps, and they feed back, and they get their authorities through these three central fora. On the left-hand side, of course, the DOD is controlled through the Defense Staff Council at the time, And on the right hand, the indication that Arms Corps is then controlled by the Arms Corps Board of Directors. And then from there, once the Board of Directors gives the final authority for the contracts, then the Arms Corps contracts go out to the suppliers, which is indicated in the block at the right. This is just an overview to give a broad indication of how much more integrated it became post the Defence Review and the MODAC reports.
If I may just ask you to go back.
Chair, the COD is the Council on Defence, which is chaired by the Minister of Defence.
If I may just ask you to go back to the previous slide. You made reference there to the SANDF on the one side and Arms Corps on that other side operating in silos. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Chair, this diagram gives a broad overview of the situation at that time. This is the arms embargo period, pre-Defence Review. The SADF, in terms of the Defence Act 44 of 1957, and Arms Corps was created in terms of the Arms Corps Act. Now, the Arms Corps Act created Arms Corps to be an acquisition agency in its own right for the Department of Defence. So it was at some point in history, it was a very powerful organization. And the DOD, or the SADF, did not have a large amount of direct control over Arms Corps. Arms Corps also at that time had its own budget. Whereas if we look at the new diagram, by this stage, Arms Corps no longer had its own budget, and Arms Corps' budget became the first commitment on the DOD's budget. So the DOD became far more integrally involved with Arms Corps activities as a consequence of the changes that were made.
So does this mean also that the integration in the roles played by both DOD and Arms Corps in the acquisition process resulted in the kind of armaments that were sought by the DOD being acquired as sought by it?
With the advent of the integrated project teams, the teams started working much closer together in a more integrated fashion. One will see later on, when the SDPs are described, that each SDP had an Arms Corps project officer and an Arms Corps program manager and a DOD project officer, and they worked together as an integrated entity, so they made decisions together, whereas previously it was done separately. This consequently leads to a better end product in the long run.
You may continue to your next slide.
Chair, at this stage I think it is just a good point to just highlight the roles of the various parties in this entire process. And I would like to indicate that while Arms Corps derived its mandate from the Armaments Development Act 57 of 1968, as it was amended over times, the roles of the parties in the defence family were for the first time clearly and in one place defined in the Ministry of Defence Acquisition MODAC 1 report. So these roles that I'm indicating here is extracted from that MODAC report. And I would like to start with the Minister of Defence's role. Minister of Defence is the ultimate political authority and responsibility for the acquisition function, Whereas the SANDF is primarily responsible for the determination of armaments requirements as derived from and substantiated against the approved force structure and in accordance with policies, programs and budgets. During the execution of armament acquisition programs, the SANDF is responsible for overall project management. It's responsible to ensure that the stated requirements are satisfied through the acquisition of optimized user systems. And it's responsible for the final acceptance of these systems against the stated needs. And we will see later on as I proceed through the process how all of this interlinks and integrates. The Defence Secretariat is responsible to ensure that all acquisition activities are executed within the national objectives, policies and constraints. It's also responsible for the high-level programming and budgeting and the in-year control and auditing of the defence expenditure. And we have seen some of those functions in the DoD structure that we've indicated. Armscor, in turn, is responsible for the professional program management and contracting of the industry during the execution of the armament acquisition programs. During the execution thereof, Armscor ensures technical, financial and legal integrity are in accordance with the MOD's requirements. They're also responsible to oversee industrial development in order to support acquisition programs, and we see that also coming out later on. The role of the industry is defined in terms of the VB 1000. In those days, as I've indicated before, national self-sufficiency and the promotion of local industries were pursued as far as it was practicable and economically justifiable. And that economically justifiable becomes quite an important point later on, in order to meet the weapons requirements and to promote the export thereof. Now, the SDPPs are not in this domain. Thus, the starting point must be the maximum utilization of local industry by means of developing and or obtaining an established technology, and by developing and maintaining industrial capabilities in support of local design, development, manufacture and supply, with percentage preference for local design and contact as laid down by legislation. Now, at the time, in the early days, pre the transformation, this was particularly applicable in the time period where the country had to be self-sufficient on its armaments. Move to the next slide, please. Now, this slide is a diagram that I don't think I've included it in the evidence itself, but it is a slide that I have made just to give an indication of the relationship between the SANDF or the SADF, the Defence Material Division, or and Armscor. Now, at the bottom of this diagram, there is a number of documents indicated. It starts with the ROC, which is a required operational capability, through to a staff target, staff requirement, a project study report, a development plan, an acquisition plan, and then the acquisitioning. And what this diagram, although it's not 100% to scale, but it suffices to give the picture, is that in the early stages of the project, the SANDF is quite heavily involved, with lesser involvement by Armscor and by the Defence Material Division. What this means is that the SANDF is involved and responsible for stating its requirement. And then we will see here at the point of the staff requirement that suddenly Armscor and the Defence Material Division's level of effort in this process picks up dramatically and the SANDF's level of effort reduces. The reason why this is because the project now moves into the domain of the Defence Material Division and more so into the domain of Arms Corps, where they start leading the process. So whilst the project study is executed, Arms Corps leads that process, but the Defence Material Division is quite heavily involved in the sense that the project officer that now works for the Defence Material Division is the individual that's charged with the responsibility to write the project study report. Similarly with the development plan and similarly to the acquisition plan. Then once the acquisition plan is approved, the activities of the SANDF starts increasing again because they become more involved again. At this stage, the product is manufactured, and by the time that the system is being commissioned, the SANDF now takes the lead role again, and we're getting to the end of the project stage. So what the slide merely indicates is what the relationship is between the three parties within the Arms Corps and the DOD, and what their level of effort is over time and in different stages of the project.
Captain, I know you will be giving greater detail of evidence regarding the various documents and information that is required during the acquisition life cycle, as the slide seeks to demonstrate. Could you just, for clarity, explain each of the steps that, in terms of which you say the various role players become involved and the extent of their involvement, by just explaining what each of those steps are and what each one of them entails?
Chair, starting at the left, the required operational capability is a document that is defined internally in the SANDF, and it is a document, and if the Commission will recall, I reflected in my evidence before lunch that a comparison is made between the existing capability and what the capability the SANDF requires to be able to fulfill its constitutional mandate. That delta that I refer to leads to the establishment of this ROC. There may be a number of deltas that emanates from, or a number of ROCs that emanates from that delta that has been established. Once that ROC is completed in its process and it's approved, a decision is made whether it is to be fulfilled by means of a project or whether it's going to be fulfilled by means of an internal arm of service process. Should it be decided to become that it must be a project, a study is done, and on completion of that study, the output of the study is a staff target. The staff target states this requirement in high-level terms, and once it is approved, and the staff target is a very important document because it reflects the project decision, and I will say more about that later on. The staff target is then developed over time, and a staff requirement is established. The staff requirement is an expansion of the requirement, now from high-level capability and operational terms to more functional terms. So it expands quite rapidly, and later on in the testimony I will show a diagram to show how we gain confidence through this process. Once the staff requirement is finalized and approved, that establishes the requirement of the SADF. And that's the requirement that needs to be satisfied, and that is the requirement in the end that we're going to meet or measure the success of this project that was established. The project study is intended to evaluate the various options that is available to satisfy the requirement with. Eventually a primary option is selected, and then the process may split into two directions. If there are suitable products available on the market, we can then directly go to an acquisition study, the output of which is an acquisition plan. If there is no suitable product on the market, or for some sensitive reasons, a product like that is not desirable to buy it off the open market, one can decide to go into a development cycle. Then a development study would be done, and a development plan would be the output of that, and that plan would basically indicate how we are going to go through the process of developing this product. In the arms embargo period, this was the order of the day, and a lot of the projects that we embarked on were development projects, because there was nothing available on the market that we could buy. The market was closed. Now in the honeymoon period after the democratic dispensation, the market is open, and consequently it is easier and much more cost effective to go the direct acquisition route, and that is typically what the path that the SDPPs have followed. The acquisition plan is yet another very important document, because the acquisition plan provides the authority for the expenditure for the greatest portion of the funds that is to be expended on the program. After all, it is the plan that approves the expenditure to acquire the main product intended to be established by the specific project. Once the acquisition plan is approved, the program is then allowed to go out there, place the contracts, establish the products, accept them and deliver them to the arms of the service, by which time now the commissioning stage is started, and the systems are commissioned into the SANDF. That is a high level, a quick explanation of the process overall.
Thank you, Captain. I see the next slide deals with the flow of policies and acts, and the various subsequent slides deal with that. And would you agree that these slides are more excerpts of the chart that you referred to earlier on in your evidence?
Chair, I agree. Those are excerpts from the Appendix A that we have dealt with earlier on in the testimony, because it is a rather large spreadsheet that is in that appendix. It was not possible to show it in one go on the screen, and that's why I've split it up. Suffice to say, I think earlier on we have dealt with the next couple of slides to some extent already, so I propose that it is not necessary to deal with these slides again, and that we could skip them.
Could we then go to the slides that deal with the Captain, perhaps while it may be imprudent to repeat your earlier testimony that you've adduced in relation to the chart, perhaps just for clarity, it might help the commissioners once again and the members of the audience to just deal with these slowly and stating what each one of them dealt with.
Okay, Chair, as I've indicated, these next couple of slides reflects the contents of the table that is contained in the appendix that we have discussed earlier. If we look at the table, at the top of the table, we will see the years indicated. I've previously indicated that 1993 is missing because nothing significant happened in that year that I could indicate on a table, and further on, later on, we have find a similar situation. So the policies or the events that are applicable to this testimony is indicated on the left-hand column. And we will see there, taking it back to pre-1992, that the VB 1000, an Afrikaans version is indicated there. I was unable to establish the date of it. By 11 February 92, VB 1000 issue 2 came into being, and 2 years later, 20 April 1994, we had VB 1000 issue 2. At the same time, Log 12 Pamphlet 2, which traces back to earlier even than 1986, became effective in July 1994. Then the Minister of Defence ordered the MODAC investigation. The MODAC Report 1 was approved on the 10th of February 1995. MODAC Report number 2 was approved on the 26th of December 1995. Then we saw the White Paper on Defence being approved on the 14th of May 1996, and the third MODAC report was presented to the Minister on the 31st of May 1996. However, the Minister then decided that Arms Corps was to continue as defined in the Arms Corps Act, the existing Arms Corps Act, which was Act 57 of 1968, as it was amended. Next slide. Yeah.
Sorry, Captain. Before you go to the next slide, could you just remind us what MODAC stands for?
MODAC is the Ministry of Defence Acquisition Work Group.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Chair, then in 1997 we saw, and by this time the strategic defence packages had already been initiated and there was lots of activity. The Minister, as I've indicated previously, saw it to be necessary to establish this policy 4/147, and it was approved by the Council on Defence, which is chaired by the Minister on the 8th of August 1997. Then in 1998, we saw the Defence Review being approved by Parliament in April 1998. The Strategic Office Committee, SOFCOM, was mandated on the 7th of April 1998. The International Office Negotiating Team, the IONT, was established on the 25th of January 1999. Those SPDM numbers that I have refers to just the search capability that we have to find the documents quite easily. The acquisition policy ACQ 1 of 98 became effective on the 19th of July 1999. The SDPP contracts were all signed on the 3rd of December 1999. Joint investigation report submitted to the Speaker on the 14th of November 2001. Then the next two documents were the newer iterations of the acquisition policy. Edition 1 became effective 27 September 2004, and Edition 2 about 3-4 months later in the new format on the 16th of November 2004. And then the current policy that we have that is in force at the moment became effective on the 21st of May. And then I've indicated there the establishment of the Arms Procurement Commission and the time that the hearings had commenced on the 5th of August. So the intention of this flow of policies and events is just to act as a timeline so that one has a ready reference to the main policies and events that took place during this time period.
You may then proceed to deal with the policies as they are applied in terms of your slides.
Chair, the VB 1000 and the Log 12 pamphlet 2. I see I've got a typo there on the slide. It's Log 12 pamphlet 2, not Log 12 pamphlet 12. Predate the integration of the various defense forces and the creation of the SANDF. Thus, in certain instances, I am making reference, and I have been making reference to the SADF instead of the SANDF. Those references are made in line with the policies as they are written. So it is not an error or some political statement that I'm trying to make. VB 1000 issue 2 and Log 12 pamphlet 2 government acquisition prior to and during the SDPPs. However, following the approval of the MODAC 1 report on or about 10 February 95, recommendations made in this report with respect to approval forums and levels were thereafter implemented. And we saw that fairly soon afterwards. The Department of Defense started to develop a new policy in the form of this ACQ 1 of 98, and it was finally approved on the 19th of July 99. I must, however, point out that to write these policies consumes quite a considerable amount of time. The VB 1000 describes the policy in respects of the approach to be followed by members of the defense family in the acquisition of the weapon systems. This document consists of 3 chapters and 8 appendices. I'm going to focus on the 3 chapters. The chapter 1 is an introduction and basically provides the scope, the philosophy, some of which we've already heard, terms of reference, and the mandate of the participating parties. Chapter 2 is the policy part of this document, and it describes the policy to be applied with regards to the management and acquisition of the acquisition process, particularly pertaining to the Category 1 material as the primary physical component of the user systems. It further describes the required inputs from the definition of requirements phase and the outputs right up to the operational phase. The phases will become clear a little bit later in the testimony. Inputs from the existing operational environment are of decisive importance to the execution of this policy. As I've indicated before, the SADF, as it was at the time, is at all times responsible for professionally stating its requirements with regards to operational armaments, thus enabling Arms Corps and the industry to effectively and economically meet these requirements by means of the development or the procurement and the subsequent supply of equipment. This means that development of armaments will be directed by these requirements and by existing or low-risk technology and take place gradually through consecutive phases inter alia through the use of models. Now, this use of models refers by and large to the development route that I've described before, as opposed to the direct acquisition route, which I will describe as well. Chair, during each phase, the models will be subjected to testing and evaluation in order to demonstrate the objectives of that particular phase have been properly achieved. Now already we can start seeing emerging the element of risk management in the process. Whereas We will do a stage of the program, test and evaluate, and only then continue, and then do a further stage, test and evaluate, and then continue further. It also implies that financial authorization can in principle only be granted after objectives of the preceding phase have been found to be complete and acceptable and have been formally approved.
Now, what does this mean in terms of the slide that you explained, which has the roles of the different role players within the SANDF, Defense Material Division and AMSCO? What are these different phases? If you could remind us, please.
So if I can, Chair, if I can relate back to earlier testimony, I pointed out that we start off with a concept and definition phase at a very high level, and then we move through the various stages. After the definition phase, we start with a design development phase. Finally, we go into the actual acquisition and production stages, and towards the end of the project life cycle, we move into a commissioning phase. Later on, there is a slide that depicts these phases quite clearly.
You can proceed with the chapter 3.
Chapter 3 of this document deals with acquisition management. This part identifies and describes the spectrum of functions included in the process of system development and hierarchical integration for acquisition, with outputs for the operational phase. What the VB1000 does not address is the employment of forces, and it pertains only to the acquisition of user systems for the continued readiness of forces. It describes the life cycle of combat capabilities by means of a model of primary phases, namely planning, acquisition, and operation. Underlying the above classification is a systems engineering process by means of which functional needs are translated into technical terms and are documented, which then eventually, after manufacture and qualification, results in the establishment of the operationally suitable combat capabilities. A system is a combination of mutually dependent systems or items, assemblies, skills, techniques, doctrines, and anything that can play and or support an operational role in an intended environment. Therefore, we have a system hierarchy which exists, and this hierarchy is broken down into 8 levels. And this slide gives us an indication of the various levels in the system hierarchy. Now, if I start at the top, level 8 is an operational force, and we will see down the left-hand side of this diagram is indicated the SANDF. The top 3 levels, level 8, 7, and 6, is dealt with normally by the SANDF. Level 5 primarily by Arms Corps. Sometimes they deal with level 4 as well. But industry, in principle, deals with level 4 through to level 1. And I will describe each of the levels. Level 8 is at an operational force level. That is a fully deployable and usable force. At a very high level, and it is generally integrated between the arms of the service, and it can also be integrated internationally. A combat grouping at level 7 is an integration between various elements of forces, and we would find that the Joint Operations Division would operate at these levels 7 and 8. The user system level is the lowest fully functional and usable level that one can define. It includes the 4 structure elements It includes the logistics, it includes the personnel, it includes the supply lines, and it includes the training associated with a specific system. At level 6, we can start physically using the system properly. Level 5, the product system level, is a system at which Arms Corps generally does the acquisition